I got a frantic call from my bank manager on what was supposed to be a quiet Tuesday morning. "Your son is standing in my lobby right now," he whispered, his voice shaking. "He is using a power of attorney to withdraw your entire $8.5 million retirement trust." I did not scream. I did not panic. I simply wiped the sawdust from my calloused hands, took a deep breath, and replied, "Freeze the transfer immediately and prepare the documents to cancel every single credit card his wife owns." 2 hours later, my son was crying on my voicemail, begging for forgiveness. But my answer shocked him to his core. If you are watching this, please hit the subscribe button and let me know in the comments which city you are listening from. Now let me tell you how my own flesh and blood tried to destroy me and how I taught him a lesson he will never forget. The smell of fresh-cut pine is usually the only thing that calms my mind. At 71 years old, I have earned the right to a quiet life. I was standing in my woodshop at the back of my property in Denver, Colorado. The morning sun was just starting to warm the crisp mountain air. I was running a piece of oak through the sander, enjoying the simple work of my hands. For a man who spent 40 years building a heavy construction empire from the dirt. Up this small shop was my absolute sanctuary. I had handed over the daily operations of Dalton Construction to my son Brad, thinking it was finally time to step back. I thought I had secured my legacy. I thought my family was safe and my future was protected. Then the phone in my pocket vibrated. It was a sharp, persistent buzzing that cut right through the peaceful hum of the machinery. I turned off the sander. I pulled out my phone and looked at the bright screen. It was Tom Higgins. Tom has been the manager of my primary bank branch for over 15 years. He is a careful, meticulous man who never calls unless it is a matter of absolute importance. I wiped the fine dust from my fingers and answered the call. "Rick, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Tom said. He did not even bother with a polite greeting. His voice was hushed tight with an intense anxiety that immediately made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "I am hiding in my private office right now. Brad is out there in the main lobby. He is sitting at one of the executive desks." I frowned, leaning against my sturdy workbench. "What is he doing down there, Tom? Is there a problem with the company payroll accounts?" Tom took a shaky breath. "It is not the company accounts, Rick. It is your personal retirement trust. Brad just walked in and handed my staff a full legal power of attorney document. It has your signature right there on the bottom line. He is demanding an immediate wire transfer of the entire balance, all $8.5 million. He wants it moved into a newly formed limited liability company that we have absolutely no record of, an LLC that he exclusively controls." For a long moment, the world simply stopped spinning. The silence in my woodshop became heavy and deafening. I did not speak a single word. I could only stare down at my own hands. They are rough, heavily scarred, and permanently stained with the ghosts of 40 years of backbreaking labor. That $8.5 million was not just a random number on a computer screen. It was not money I inherited from a rich father. It was the physical manifestation of my entire existence. It was the freezing, brutal Colorado winters where I stood out on the barren highways, laying boiling asphalt while the wind chill dropped below zero. It was the countless years my late wife Martha spent sitting at our small kitchen table late at night, clipping paper grocery coupons and stretching a single pot of cheap stew to last us 3 entire days, just so we could make payroll for our struggling crew. That money was Martha's ultimate sacrifice. It was the rock-solid foundation of the empire I built to ensure my only son would never have to know the gnawing hunger I had endured. And now that same exact son was calmly trying to steal every single penny of it behind my back. "Rick, are you still there?" Tom asked, his voice trembling. "The power of attorney looks completely legitimate. The legal department is reviewing it right now. If I do not execute this wire transfer soon, he is going to cause a massive scene. He says he is acting on your direct orders because you are allegedly not feeling well. The sheer audacity of the lie was like a physical blow to my chest. Acting on my orders. The betrayal tasted like bitter ash in my mouth. A normal, loving father might have broken down in tears, but I am a man who survived the cutthroat, unforgiving world of commercial construction. You do not survive in that brutal industry by reacting with soft emotion. You survive by being colder and far more ruthless than the guy actively trying to put you out of business. The shock rapidly faded away, replaced by a deep, terrifying calm. I stood up straight. The loving father died in that exact moment right there on the sawdust-covered floor. The CEO took over, Tom. I said, my voice incredibly steady. Do not let him know you are speaking to me. Go back out there and smile. Tell him that for any transfer over $5 million involving a power of attorney, federal banking regulations require a mandatory 24-hour security verification hold. Blame the government. Tell him the funds will clear tomorrow. That buys us 24 hours. What are you going to do? Tom asked. I looked up at the ceiling. My mind was already moving 5 steps ahead. Before I deal with Brad, pull up the joint credit card accounts I co-signed for him and his wife Monica. Cancel them permanently. Flag them as compromised. When Monica tries to buy her luxury lunch today, I want her card declined in front of everyone. Lock down every dime. If they want a war, Tom, they just declared it on the absolute wrong man. I hung up the phone and stood in the center of my woodshop for a long moment. The silence was heavy, broken only by the settling of dust. I did not rush. I methodically unplugged the sander, wiped down the workbench, and locked the heavy wooden doors behind me. Panic is a luxury a man in my position cannot afford. I walked across the gravel driveway toward my truck. It is a 1998 Ford F-150 painted a faded navy blue. Brad had begged me for years to buy a new luxury vehicle, something fitting for the founder of a multi-million-dollar construction firm. He drove a pristine black German sports car that cost more than my first 3 houses combined. But I kept the Ford. I kept it because the seats still held the faint scent of Martha's perfume from when we used to drive up to the mountains on Sunday afternoons. I kept it because the dents in the tailgate reminded me of the heavy equipment we hauled when the company was just a desperate dream. I climbed into the cab, the old springs groaning under my weight. I turned the ignition, and the engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. I put the truck in gear and headed down the winding driveway, steering toward the heart of Denver. The drive into the city gave me time to process the magnitude of what was happening. Through the windshield, I watched the Denver skyline rise against the backdrop of the snow-capped Rocky Mountains. I knew those streets better than anyone. My company had poured the concrete for half the commercial foundations in the downtown district. I had built bridges that carried thousands of commuters every single day. I had constructed hospitals where lives were saved and schools where futures were shaped. I built things meant to last for generations. Yet the one thing I thought I had built with the utmost care, my own family, was actively crumbling beneath my feet. I gripped the worn leather steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I thought about Brad. I had given him every advantage I never had. Private schools, expensive tutors, a corner office with his name etched in frosted glass. I wanted to spare him the blisters and the broken bones. Looking back, maybe that was my greatest failure. I smoothed the road for him so much that he never learned how to walk on rough terrain. He never learned the value of a single hard-earned dollar. He only learned how to spend what someone else had bled to acquire. Just as I merged onto the interstate, the heavy silence in the cab was shattered. My cell phone resting in the center console began to ring. I glanced down. The screen lit up with a picture of Brad. It was a photo from a company Christmas party 2 years ago. He was wearing a tailored Italian suit, smiling a bright, confident smile, holding a glass of expensive champagne. Right next to him stood his wife, Monica, draped in designer silk, wearing a diamond necklace I had paid for as a wedding gift. I stared at that smiling face as the phone vibrated against the plastic console. It rang until it went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it started ringing again. Then again. He was relentless. The panic was setting in for him. He must have realized that Tom Higgins at the bank was stalling. The 24-hour security verification excuse had thrown a massive wrench into whatever desperate, hurried plan he had concocted. He knew the clock was ticking, and he knew I was the only one who could authorize the release of those funds. The phone rang a fourth time. I reached down, but I did not answer. Instead, I pressed the button to decline the call, sending him straight to the automated voicemail system. I needed to hear his strategy. I needed to know exactly what kind of lie he was going to try and sell me. A moment later, a small notification chimed. "You have one new voice message." I pulled the Ford over onto the shoulder of the highway, shifting the gear into park. The cars sped past me, shaking the cab, but my focus was entirely on the small device in my hand. I tapped the screen and pressed play on the speakerphone. The audio filled the truck. At first there was just heavy breathing, followed by a pathetic, trembling sniffle. Then Brad's voice broke through, thick with artificial tears. "Dad." He began, his voice cracking perfectly on the first syllable. "Dad, please pick up the phone. You have to talk to me." Tom at the bank is completely confused. There is a huge misunderstanding going on, and everything is getting blown way out of proportion. I am just trying to secure a massive commercial real estate deal for the company, and I needed to use the trust as a temporary bridge loan. I was going to put it all right back by Friday, I swear to God. "Dad, please, I am begging you. Do not block this transfer. If we lose this deal, the company will suffer a catastrophic blow. I did not tell you because of your heart condition. I did not want to stress you out. I am doing this for us, Dad. I am doing this for the family. Please, just call the bank and clear this up. I love you, Dad. I am so sorry for the confusion. Just call me back." I moved to delete it, but something stopped me. I pulled the phone closer, replaying the audio at maximum volume. Beneath his sobbing, there was another sound. I closed my eyes and listened. It was Monica. Her whispered words were sharp and venomous. "Keep crying, idiot," she hissed. "The old man is dying anyway. He will cave if you play the victim." My blood turned to solid ice. I put the truck back in drive and pulled away from the side of the highway. The rest of the journey to the downtown financial district was an absolute blur of gray concrete and flashing traffic lights. My mind endlessly replayed that wicked whisper over and over again in the quiet cab of my truck. The old man is dying anyway. I pulled into the private underground parking garage beneath the towering bank building. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my joints ached with a dull, throbbing pain. I parked in the VIP section and bypassed the main public lobby entirely. I used the secure service elevator reserved strictly for high-net-worth clients and bank executives. When the steel doors opened onto the plush carpet of the executive floor, Tom Higgins was already waiting for me at the glass double doors. His face was visibly pale, his tie slightly loosened, and his eyes darted nervously down the hallway. He quickly ushered me into his private, soundproof corner office and immediately locked the heavy oak door behind us. Tom did not offer a greeting. He did not offer me a cup of coffee. He simply walked over to his massive mahogany desk, picked up a thick manila folder, and slid it across the polished wood surface toward me. He took a deep breath and gestured toward the file. I stepped forward and opened it. Inside was a crisp, neatly stapled legal document consisting of a dozen pages. I picked it up, my calloused fingers brushing against the heavy stock paper. My eyes carefully scanned the dense legal jargon printed on the first page. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. It explicitly granted Bradley Dalton absolute and unconditional control over all my personal financial assets, my real estate holdings, and the entirety of my retirement trust funds. I slowly turned the pages, feeling a cold knot tightening in the pit of my stomach. Then I reached the final page. I stared down at the bottom line. There, resting quietly in stark black ink, was my personal signature. I leaned in closer, inspecting the loops and angles. It was not a clever forgery. It was not a digitally scanned copy. It was the distinct, slightly slanted cursive script I had used to sign thousands of construction contracts over the past 4 decades. I traced the dry ink with my right index finger. I knew with absolute certainty that I had never knowingly agreed to this arrangement, yet there was my given name undoubtedly penned by my own living hand. "How did he manage to get this?" Tom whispered, leaning heavily against the edge of his desk. I closed my eyes, letting the question hang in the quiet room. Suddenly, a dark memory hit me with the overwhelming force of a runaway freight train. 3 months ago, I had been rushed to the emergency room in the middle of the night after collapsing at a downtown job site. It turned out to be a relatively minor heart arrhythmia brought on by severe dehydration and physical exhaustion. However, the attending doctors had pumped my veins full of strong chemical sedatives and potent blood thinners. I spent 3 miserable days in a sterile white hospital room, drifting helplessly in and out of a heavy drug-induced fog. On the final morning of my stay, Brad and Monica arrived together. They played the roles of the terrified, endlessly devoted children to absolute perfection. Monica had brought my favorite hot soup from a local diner. She spent the morning fluffing my pillows and speaking to me in a soft, incredibly soothing voice. Brad stood right by the side of my hospital bed, holding a thick stack of papers secured to a wooden clipboard. He told me they were just routine hospital discharge forms, basic medical insurance waivers, and standard emergency health directives that the administration needed signed immediately, so I could finally go home and sleep in my own bed. My vision was terribly blurry from the intravenous medication. My head was pounding with a relentless rhythmic ache. I just wanted the miserable experience to end. Brad kept rapidly flipping the pages back for me, pointing exactly where I needed to sign. He rushed me along with a gentle, reassuring smile on his face. "Sign right here, Dad. Just one more on this page, Dad. Do not worry about reading the small print. We will take care of absolutely everything for you." They had slipped this total financial death warrant right into the middle of my medical release papers. They used my illness as a weapon. I opened my eyes and looked directly back at Tom. The horrifying reality of their betrayal was far worse than a sudden, impulsive act of greed. This was not a desperate, last-minute mistake to cover a bad gambling debt. This was a cold, brilliantly calculated, and entirely premeditated assassination of my financial life. They had been secretly planning this ambush for months. They had weaponized my moment of extreme physical weakness to quietly slit my throat while looking me straight in the eyes. I felt a new kind of anger rising inside me. It was not a hot, explosive rage. It was a freezing, calculating fury. "Tom," I said, my voice dropping to a gravelly, commanding whisper. "I need you to draw up the block orders right now. Revoke this fraudulent power of attorney immediately based on medical deception. I want a complete, impenetrable freeze put on the trust. Furthermore, I want every single credit card, debit card, and joint checking account linked to Brad and Monica terminated effective this very second. Cut their financial lifelines completely, without any hesitation. Let them feel the immediate consequences of their actions today." Tom nodded quickly, his face serious, moving straight to his computer keyboard to begin typing. "Consider it done, Rick," he said. I watched the bright computer screen glow, knowing the real war had just finally begun today. I left the bank through the secure rear exit, my mind colder and sharper than it had been in a decade. I drove back to my house, the large stone property sitting quietly at the end of a private road. I parked the Ford, walked inside, and brewed a pot of strong black coffee. I knew it would not take long for him to come. I sat at the kitchen table nursing the hot mug, staring out the bay window at the setting sun. Less than 40 minutes later, the screech of expensive tires echoed up the driveway. Through the glass, I watched Brad's sleek black German sports car aggressively pull up to the front porch. He practically threw himself out of the driver's seat. He looked absolutely terrible. His usually perfect hair was disheveled. The collar of his expensive dress shirt was unbuttoned, and a dark ring of sweat stained his underarms. He was shaking as he fumbled with his keys at the front door. I remained seated at the kitchen table, composing my face into a mask of weary confusion and paternal concern. The front door burst open, and Brad hurried down the hallway, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the hardwood floor. "Dad!" he gasped, bursting into the kitchen. He stopped in his tracks when he saw me sitting calmly with my coffee. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a manufactured, desperate panic. "Dad, thank God you are home. We need to talk right now." I looked up at him, letting my shoulders slump slightly to mimic the posture of a tired, clueless old man. "Brad." "What on earth is going on?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and deliberately fragile. "Tom Higgins called me in a total panic today. He babbled something about you taking my retirement money and federal security holds. You know I do not understand all those complicated banking regulations." "Sit down, son. You look like you are about to have a heart attack." Brad collapsed into the chair across from me, burying his face in his trembling hands for a dramatic second before looking up. His eyes were red, perfectly playing the part of the overwhelmed heir. "Dad, you have to call Tom immediately and lift that security hold," he pleaded, his voice cracking with urgency. "Tom is an old fool who does not understand modern high-level finance. He is ruining everything. I was trying to protect you, but now I have to explain it." "Protect me from what, Brad?" I asked, tilting my head, making sure my expression stayed perfectly innocent. "What are you talking about?" Brad leaned forward, resting his sweaty forearms on the kitchen table. He took a deep breath, preparing to deliver the lie he and Monica had undoubtedly rehearsed on the phone. "It is a commercial real estate deal, Dad. The biggest deal Dalton Construction has ever seen in 40 years. We have the exclusive inside track to purchase an entire city block in the new downtown tech corridor. The city is rezoning it next month, and property values are going to skyrocket overnight. But the sellers demanded a massive immediate cash deposit to secure the escrow. We did not have enough liquid cash in the corporate accounts without triggering a painful tax audit." He paused, searching my face for any sign of suspicion. Seeing only my carefully crafted blank stare, he pushed forward with renewed confidence. "I needed $8.5 million by tomorrow morning to lock in the contract." He continued, speaking faster now. "It is just a temporary bridge loan, Dad. A completely standard financial maneuver in the corporate world. Once the deal is publicly announced next week, the bank will release our commercial credit lines, and I was going to put every single penny right back into your retirement trust. Plus a massive dividend. This deal is going to absolutely double the Dalton family wealth. I am talking generational money, Dad. I am trying to build our empire." I stared at him, feeling a wave of absolute disgust wash over me. He was lying straight to my face, painting himself as the brilliant corporate savior, while secretly trying to hand my life savings over to the worst criminals in Denver. But I could not let him see the monster he had awakened. I had to play the victim he believed me to be. "If it is such a great deal, Brad, why sneak around?" I asked, keeping my voice weak and slightly hurt. "Why not just come to me and ask? Why use that power of attorney behind my back?" This was the moment he had been waiting for. The emotional kill shot. He reached across the table and grabbed my hand. His palms were clammy and cold. "Because of your heart, Dad," he cried, squeezing my fingers tight. "You were in the hospital just 3 months ago. The doctors told us that any severe stress could trigger a massive fatal cardiac event. Do you have any idea how much pressure I am under? I am carrying the entire weight of this company on my shoulders. Every payroll, every contract, every lawsuit, it all falls on me now. I lie awake every single night stressing over how to keep the Dalton legacy alive. I did not tell you because I love you. I wanted to hand you the finalized contracts next week as a surprise. I wanted you to be proud of me, and I did not want to risk putting you back in that hospital bed." The sheer manipulation was breathtaking. He was using my own mortality, the very weakness he and Monica were banking on, to guilt-trip me into submission. He was trying to make me feel guilty for questioning his blatant theft. It took every ounce of discipline I possessed to keep my hand relaxed in his grip. I wanted to reach across the table and physically throw him right out of my own house. I kept my hand relaxed in his tight, sweaty grip. I even managed to conjure a small, trembling sigh, playing the part of the relieved, forgiving father perfectly. "I understand, son," I said, my voice softening just the right amount to sound completely convinced. "I really do. You are carrying a heavy load, and you just wanted to make me proud. You should not have hidden it from me, but I understand the pressure you are under. Let us not fight about this anymore." Brad let out a massive exhale, his shoulders dropping 2 inches as the manufactured panic drained from his body. He practically melted back into the kitchen chair. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered, wiping a fake tear saw from the corner of his eye. "I promise you, this deal is going to change everything for us. You will not regret trusting me." I stood up slowly, putting a gentle, reassuring hand on his shoulder. I felt the expensive fabric of his shirt beneath my rough fingers. "Tell you what, Brad." I continued, leaning in close. "The bank has that 24-hour security hold on the large trust account, and I do not want to trigger any red flags with the federal regulators by fighting it right now. But I know you need immediate liquidity to secure that escrow deposit. So tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I will personally go down to a different branch. I will open a brand new separate account and wire $500,000 directly into your corporate holding fund. That should be more than enough to lock the sellers in and show them we are completely serious until the rest of the capital clears next week. How does that sound?" Brad stared at me, his eyes widening in pure, unadulterated relief. For a split second, I saw the genuine greedy hunger flash across his face, entirely replacing the sorrowful act. The bait was dangling right in front of him, and he took it hook, line, and sinker. "That is perfect, Dad." He practically choked on his words, standing up to pull me into a tight embrace. "That is more than enough. You are saving the company. I will have the legal team draft the preliminary contracts tonight. You are the best, Dad. I mean it." I patted his back twice, feeling absolutely nothing but cold resolve. "Go home, Brad," I told him, stepping back and giving him a warm paternal smile. "Go home to Monica. Take a shower, get a good night of sleep, and let me handle the bank tomorrow. Everything is going to be just fine." He nodded eagerly, practically skipping down the hallway toward the front door. He was so incredibly eager to leave with his victory that he did not even bother to say a proper goodbye. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, listening to the heavy wooden front door shut behind him. I listened to the sharp click of the deadbolt. I listened to his rapid footsteps pounding across the wooden planks of the front porch. The second I heard the heavy guttural roar of his sports car engine fire up, the warm, loving father vanished entirely. The mask dropped, and the cold-blooded CEO returned to the surface. I did not move toward the window to watch him drive away. Instead, I calmly reached into my back pocket and pulled out my tablet. 3 years ago, when I first started noticing small, unexplained discrepancies in the minor accounts Brad managed, I had quietly hired a private security firm. They installed a network of high-definition audio-enabled cameras, hidden completely out of sight, in the eaves of the roof, the porch lights, and the garage fixtures. Brad thought the old man was too technologically illiterate to know how to connect to a modern Wi-Fi router, let alone manage a stealth surveillance system. I tapped the screen, loading the live feed from the camera, positioned directly above the front door. The high-resolution video loaded instantly, showing the crisp, darkening evening light on the porch. Brad had not gone straight to his car. He was standing near the edge of the steps, safely out of view from the kitchen window, pacing nervously back and forth. He had his sleek smartphone pressed hard against his ear. His body language had completely changed. The sorrowful, exhausted son was gone. He was standing tall, his free hand chopping through the air aggressively as he spoke to whoever was on the other end of the line. I tapped the volume icon on the tablet, turning the audio feed up to maximum capacity. The sensitive microphone built into the porch camera picked up his voice perfectly over the low hum of his idling car engine. I held the tablet closer, my heart beating with a steady, calculated rhythm. I needed to hear every single word of this phone call. I needed to know exactly how deep this betrayal went and exactly who he was talking to. The game of polite deception was officially over. Now it was time to gather the ammunition for the execution. The high-definition video feed on my tablet was perfectly clear. The sensitive microphone picked up the rustle of the wind blowing through the pine trees in the front yard. Brad was pacing back and forth across the wooden planks of my porch. He had his phone pressed so hard against his ear that his knuckles were completely white. He was not calling Monica to share the good news. He was not calling a corporate lawyer to draft up the preliminary contracts for a massive commercial real estate deal. I watched the sharp rise and fall of his chest. His breathing was heavy, bordering on hyperventilation. The confident, articulate corporate executive I had just spoken to in my kitchen was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate animal caught firmly in a trap. He stopped pacing near the edge of the steps, looking nervously over his shoulder toward the dark driveway. Then someone finally answered the call. "Yeah, it is me," Brad said, his voice dropping to a harsh, trembling whisper. "Listen to me very carefully. You have to tell them I need just a little more time. The massive transfer got temporarily flagged by the federal banking regulators. It is a mandatory 24-hour security hold. There is absolutely nothing I can do about it tonight. But I fixed the problem. I went to the house and I talked to the old man." Brad paused, listening to whoever was screaming at him on the other end of the line. The microphone picked up the faint, tinny sound of an angry voice bleeding through the phone speaker, but I could not make out the specific words. Brad winced, pulling the phone slightly away from his ear before pressing it back. I know what they said." Brad hissed, his free hand gripping the wooden railing of the porch so tightly the wood creaked. "But you have to listen to me." The old man completely took the bait. He bought the entire real estate story without asking a single difficult question. He is completely clueless. He thinks he is saving the company. He is personally going down to the bank branch tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock to wire $500,000 directly into the corporate holding fund. I will have $500,000 in clean liquid cash by noon tomorrow. Another pause. The voice on the phone was speaking lower now, but the tone was undeniably threatening. Brad swallowed hard. The porch light caught the thick beads of sweat rolling down his forehead. "Just take the $500,000 as a good faith deposit," Brad pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine, unadulterated terror. "Tell the Coyotes to give me just one more week to clear the rest of the $8 million. I promise you I will get them every single penny I owe them plus the late penalties. Just please keep them away from my house. Keep them away from my wife. I do not want them cutting off my fingers. Tell them the money is guaranteed. Just buy me 72 more hours." Brad abruptly ended the call. He stood there on the porch for another long moment, staring out into the absolute darkness of the yard before practically running toward his sports car. The video feed captured the red glare of his taillights, speeding away down the driveway until they disappeared entirely into the night. I sat at my kitchen table, the glowing tablet resting quietly in my hands. The silence in the house felt heavier now, suffocating and incredibly dense. I did not move a single muscle for what felt like an eternity. The Coyotes. The name echoed in the empty room, bringing with it a chilling wave of memories from a very dark past. Most people in the polished corporate world of Denver had absolutely no idea who the Coyotes were. They thought the worst kind of danger came from aggressive hedge fund managers or ruthless corporate attorneys. But I knew better. Back in the early days of building my construction company, before the shiny glass high-rises and the multi-million-dollar city contracts I had to operate in the dirt, I knew the criminal underbelly that controlled the heavy equipment theft rings and the illegal gambling operations operating out of the industrial district warehouses. The Coyotes were not bankers. They were not reasonable men who settled disputes in a brightly lit courtroom. They were the most brutal, merciless underground loan sharks operating in the entire state of Colorado. They preyed on desperate businessmen, degenerate gamblers, and fools who thought they could outsmart the criminal underworld. If you borrowed money from a standard bank and defaulted, they ruined your corporate credit score. If you borrowed money from the coyotes and missed a single payment, they sent men with heavy tools to break your kneecaps, burn down your family home, or make you disappear completely into the deep foundations of a new construction site. The horrifying reality of the situation washed over me like a bucket of freezing water. There was no commercial real estate deal. There was no grand vision to double the Dalton family wealth. Brad had not just made a poor financial investment. He was in deep with a violent criminal syndicate. He had somehow managed to rack up a massive debt with ruthless killers, and now they were actively coming to collect. He was terrified. He was backed into a corner facing the absolute destruction of his physical life, and his only solution was to steal the entire life savings of his own father to buy his way out. He was willing to leave me completely destitute, to strip away the absolute last bit of security I had in this world, just to save his own skin. I slowly turned off the tablet screen, plunging the kitchen into total darkness. The lingering sadness had vanished. A cold clarity now completely controlled my mind. Brad had brought dangerous wolves. Brad had brought dangerous wolves right to our front door. If I called the local police, Brad would undoubtedly be arrested for financial fraud, but the coyotes would not simply walk away. They would systematically dismantle my company, threaten my remaining family, and burn down everything I had spent a lifetime building. The police could not protect me from the underground syndicate. I needed a completely different kind of weapon. I needed a monster of my own. I picked up my phone and dialed the private emergency number for Victor Gallagher. Victor was not a standard family attorney who handled simple wills and peaceful divorces. He was a ruthless, brilliant corporate lawyer who operated in the darkest gray areas of commercial law. He was a legal shark who had spent the last 20 years crushing rival construction firms, burying hostile takeover attempts, and financially destroying anyone who dared to cross Dalton Construction. The phone rang exactly twice before he answered. It was past 11 o'clock at night, but Victor sounded as sharp and awake as if he were standing in the middle of a crowded courtroom. "Rick," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "Tell me who we are burying tonight." I did not waste a single second on pleasantries. "Victor, I need you to mobilize your private ghost team immediately," I told him, keeping my voice dead flat. "I need your absolute best forensic accountants. I want a complete microscopic audit of every single ledger, corporate account, and shadow fund connected to Dalton Construction. I want them to tear through the firewall and track every dime that has moved through my company over the last 3 years." Victor was silent for a brief moment. "A forensic audit of your own company?" he asked, clearly intrigued. "Are we looking for external embezzlement, or is this an inside job?" I stared at the dark kitchen window. "Brad has full control of the books." I replied, the bitterness bleeding into my words. "He just tried to drain my $8.5 million retirement trust using a forged medical power of attorney. He is into the coyotes for at least $500,000 in cash, maybe significantly more. I need to know exactly how deep the rot goes before the sun comes up." I heard the sharp, definitive click of Victor pressing a pen against his desk. "The police?" Victor asked quietly. "No police," I commanded. "The coyotes do not care about police reports. I am going to handle this personally. Get the ghost team into the servers tonight. I will go down to the headquarters tomorrow morning to keep Brad entirely distracted." "Consider it done," Victor said, and hung up the phone. The next morning, the Denver sky was a cold, unforgiving shade of steel gray. I put on a simple plaid shirt and my old work boots, perfectly playing the part of the happily retired founder coming in for a casual visit. I drove the Ford down to the commercial district where the Dalton Construction headquarters stood. I had designed and built this 4-story brick and glass building myself. It was meant to be a proud, sturdy monument to honest labor and structural integrity. But as I pulled into the executive parking lot, a deep sense of wrongness settled heavily over my shoulders. Brad's black sports car was already parked directly in my old reserved space. I walked through the heavy glass front doors and stepped into the main reception area. The immediate changes were visually jarring and completely offensive to everything I stood for. The sturdy, practical reception desk I had custom-built from reclaimed oak had been ripped out and replaced with a massive, ridiculous slab of imported Italian marble. The walls, once lined with framed photographs of our best construction crews and completed bridges, were now covered in expensive, abstract modern art pieces that looked like random splatters of cheap paint. It looked less like a working construction firm and much more like a superficial Silicon Valley startup burning through venture capital. I walked past the marble desk and pushed through the double doors leading into the main operational floor. The atmosphere was incredibly toxic, thick, with an unspoken, suffocating tension. When I used to run the floor, there was always loud laughter, the smell of strong coffee, and the constant energetic shouting of project managers coordinating concrete deliveries. Now the entire office was dead silent. The project managers were hunched over their sleek new computer monitors, typing frantically. When they saw me walking down the central aisle, they did not smile or wave. They physically flinched. They quickly averted their eyes, staring down at their desks, like terrified prisoners, trying to avoid the gaze of a cruel warden. I noticed the extravagant, unnecessary expenses scattered everywhere. There were 4 brand-new commercial-grade espresso machines sitting unused in the break room, each costing more than a junior carpenter made in an entire month. The practical ergonomic chairs had been replaced with sleek, uncomfortable designer leather seats. Brad had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to create the illusion of massive corporate success, while secretly draining the company dry. I walked slowly toward the glass-walled executive suites at the back of the building. Through the transparent partitions, I could see Brad standing inside his massive office. He was wearing another perfectly tailored suit, yelling aggressively at a senior female accountant who looked like she was on the verge of tears. He pointed a sharp finger at her face, berating her with absolute cruelty. My hands curled into tight fists at my sides. He was treating my loyal employees like garbage to make himself feel powerful. I slowly forced my 2 bare hands to relax. I pasted a warm, clueless smile on my face and pushed his office door open, ready to play my part in this miserable game until Victor and his team finally delivered the ultimate financial guillotine to end this nightmare. I stepped into his sprawling office, letting the heavy glass door click shut behind me. Brad immediately stopped yelling at the senior accountant. He smoothed his expensive tie and forced a wide, completely unnatural smile onto his face. "Dad," he said, his voice dripping with fake enthusiasm. "What a pleasant surprise. I did not expect to see you down here today." I waved my hand dismissively, playing the part of the wandering old man. "Just wanted to see how the empire was running," I replied, lowering myself into one of his uncomfortable modern chairs. I spent the next hour sitting in his office, listening to him brag about imaginary profit margins and fictional corporate synergies. Every word that came out of his mouth was a calculated lie, designed to keep me completely in the dark. I nodded along, smiling warmly, while internally I was measuring him for a financial coffin. By the time I finally left the headquarters and drove back to my quiet house, the sun was already starting to set over the mountains. I did not have to wait much longer for the truth. At exactly 9 o'clock that evening, my secure cell phone rang. It was Victor. The ghost team had finished their microscopic excavation of the company servers. He told me to come to his private law office downtown immediately. He did not sound triumphant. He sounded incredibly grim. I grabbed my coat and drove back into the city, pulling into the underground garage of Victor's high-rise building. I took the private elevator straight to the top floor. When I walked into the massive oak-paneled conference room, Victor was standing at the head of a long, polished table. 3 exhausted forensic accountants were sitting around laptops, surrounded by thick stacks of printed financial ledgers. The air in the room was heavy with the smell of stale coffee and impending doom. Victor did not waste time with pleasantries. He gestured to the empty leather chair next to him. "Sit down, Rick," he said quietly. "What we found is significantly worse than we initially calculated." I sat down, bracing myself. One of the lead accountants, a pale man with dark circles under his eyes, slid a thick black binder across the polished wood. "Mr. Dalton," the accountant began, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Your son has not been running a construction company. He has been using your corporate infrastructure as a personal casino." I opened the heavy binder. The pages were filled with complex transaction logs, offshore wire transfers, and digital wallet addresses. There was no massive commercial real estate deal. There were no new city contracts. Over the past 24 months, Brad had been systematically siphoning the profit margins from every single legitimate construction project we had. He was taking the hard-earned money that our crews bled for and dumping it directly into high-leverage cryptocurrency trading. "He thought he was a financial genius," Victor explained, leaning over the table. "He bought into the digital currency hype at the absolute peak of the market. He used company assets as collateral to take out massive, highly leveraged margin loans on unregulated offshore exchanges. When the crypto market inevitably crashed last year, his digital portfolio was completely liquidated in a matter of hours. He lost absolutely everything, Rick. Every dime he stole from your operational reserves evaporated into thin air." I stared at the staggering negative numbers printed on the crisp white paper. The sheer magnitude of his absolute stupidity was breathtaking. But that was not the end of the nightmare. The accountant flipped to the next section of the binder. To cover up the massive corporate shortfall and avoid a mandatory federal audit, your son went searching for unregulated liquidity. The accountant continued. He took out a sequence of off-the-books loans. He borrowed $3 million in untraceable cash from an organized crime syndicate operating out of the industrial district. "The Coyotes." I whispered the name, feeling a cold wave of dread wash over me. "He borrowed $3 million from the Coyotes." Victor nodded slowly. "Yes. And with the exorbitant underground interest rates they charge, that $3 million has ballooned. He has been desperately juggling funds just to make the weekly minimum interest payments, but he has completely run out of runway. The Coyotes are demanding the entire principal balance by the end of the month. That is exactly why he tried to drain your $8.5 million retirement trust yesterday. He is backed into a lethal corner. If he does not pay them, they will kill him, and then they will come for the company assets." I sat back in my chair, the heavy silence of the boardroom pressing down on my chest. My own son had gambled away the blood and sweat of my entire life on digital air. He had invited violent, ruthless killers into our lives because of his reckless arrogance. I looked at Victor, my jaw set with cold, unyielding resolve. "Let them have him," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I will not sacrifice my legacy to save a thief. We will freeze him out entirely." Victor looked at me, his expression unreadable. He reached across the table and placed his hand flat on the black binder. "Dealing with Brad and the Coyotes is only the first part of the problem," Rick, Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Brad is a desperate, foolish man who made incredibly stupid financial decisions. But he is not the one holding the knife to your throat." I frowned, confused by his words. "What do you mean, Victor? Who else is there?" Victor gestured to the lead accountant, who reached into his worn leather briefcase. The accountant pulled out a separate, much thinner red folder and placed it gently on the table directly in front of me. "This file has absolutely nothing to do with cryptocurrency or the Coyotes," Victor explained. "This file has absolutely nothing to do with cryptocurrency or the Coyotes," Victor explained. He tapped his index finger against the smooth crimson cover of the folder. "This file is entirely about your daughter-in-law." I reached out and opened the red folder. Inside were bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and legal documents that had been heavily redacted by international banking institutions. I looked up at Victor, my brow furrowed in deep confusion. "Monica," I asked, Does she know about the massive debt Brad has accumulated with the loan sharks? Victor let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Know about it, he repeated, shaking his head. Rick, she did not just know about it. She orchestrated the entire collapse from the very beginning. Monica is not some innocent bystander watching her husband ruin their lives. She is the absolute mastermind behind the curtain. The lead accountant leaned forward, pointing to a complex flowchart drawn out on a large piece of legal paper. Over the past 2 years, while Brad was frantically stealing money from your construction company to cover his disastrous digital trading losses, Monica was quietly skimming right off the top of his stolen funds. Every time Brad moved $100,000 out of your corporate reserves, Monica would intercept a portion of it before it ever hit his offshore trading accounts. She was using a sophisticated network of shell companies registered under her maiden name to siphon the cash. The accountant traced his pen along a thick black line on the chart. She successfully funneled $1.2 million entirely out of the country. The money was routed through 3 different European banks before finally landing in an impenetrable offshore trust located in the Cayman Islands. I stared at the flowchart, the cold reality settling deep into my bones. Brad was an arrogant, desperate fool, but he was ultimately just a blunt instrument. Monica was the true architect of this financial slaughter. She had watched her husband panic, watched him spiral into massive debt with dangerous criminals, and instead of trying to stop him, she used his sheer desperation as a perfect smokescreen to quietly build her own personal fortune. She had intentionally let him dig his own grave while she safely hoarded the dirt. She let him take the massive loans from the Coyotes, knowing full well he would never be able to pay them back. She let him forge my signature on that power of attorney to steal my retirement trust. She was pushing him toward absolute destruction so he would take all the blame. Victor slid another piece of paper across the table. It was a retainer agreement from one of the most aggressive, high-priced family law firms in the state of Colorado. Monica secretly hired a divorce attorney 3 weeks ago, Victor said, his tone utterly devoid of sympathy. She has already drawn up the preliminary divorce filings. She is just waiting for the absolute perfect moment to serve him with the papers. Her entire plan is to let Brad take the catastrophic fall for the corporate embezzlement and the devastating debts to the criminal syndicate. While Brad is busy facing federal prison time or getting his legs broken by the Coyotes, Monica plans to file for divorce, claim she was an innocent victim of his financial abuse, and disappear to a tropical island with $1.2 million in untraceable cash. The absolute brilliance of her pure, unadulterated evil was almost difficult to comprehend. She had married my son, lived in a mansion, paid for by my sweat, smiled in my face at every single family Thanksgiving dinner, and all the while she was coldly calculating the exact dollar amount she needed to ruin us both. She did not love Brad. She viewed him as a highly disposable asset, a temporary stepping stone to secure her own luxurious future. And the moment he became too much of a liability, she was perfectly prepared to throw him directly to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. The whispered voice I had heard on the voicemail suddenly echoed in my mind again. Keep crying, idiot. The old man is dying anyway. She had been directing his performance the entire time. I closed the red folder, my hands surprisingly steady. The anger I felt earlier had completely burned away, leaving nothing but a freezing, mechanical resolve. Brad had betrayed my trust out of cowardice and greed, but Monica had plotted the total annihilation of my family with the clinical precision of a seasoned psychopath. She thought she was the smartest person in the room. She thought she had successfully manipulated a desperate husband and a clueless, dying old man. But she had made one fatal miscalculation. She had underestimated the lengths I would go to protect what was rightfully mine. I looked across the wide conference table at Victor and the exhausted team of forensic accountants. We are going to let her believe she is winning, I said, my voice echoing coldly in the quiet room. We are going to let her pack her bags and dream about the Cayman Islands. But we need to make absolutely sure she cannot access a single penny of that stolen money when the trap finally snaps shut. Victor nodded slowly, his eyes locking onto mine with a dark, predatory gleam. We have already prepared the necessary legal injunctions to freeze her offshore accounts, he assured me. But before we execute that maneuver, there is one more thing you need to see. One final piece of the puzzle that explains exactly why she pushed Brad to steal your entire retirement fund this specific week. Victor reached into his worn leather briefcase once again, his movements slow. His face was visibly paler now, completely drained of its usual corporate confidence. "This is not about the stolen money anymore, Rick," he whispered, sliding a single sheet of paper across the dark wood. "This is about your life." I looked down at the single sheet of paper resting on the polished mahogany table. The harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room seemed to reflect off the bright white surface, making the black text practically jump off the page. I reached out and picked it up. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady through the revelations of massive corporate fraud and underground criminal syndicates, suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The document was printed on the official letterhead of a private psychiatric clinic located on the quiet outskirts of Denver. It was a comprehensive medical evaluation report. I scanned the first few paragraphs, my eyes struggling to process the dense clinical terminology and the psychological jargon. But the final conclusion at the very bottom of the page was written in plain, unmistakable English. It declared me Richard Dalton legally incompetent to manage my own financial and personal affairs due to advanced, rapidly progressing dementia. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the evaluation. It belonged to a doctor I had never met in my entire life. "I have never even set foot inside this clinic," I said, my voice barely above a harsh whisper. "How could a licensed medical professional legally declare me incompetent without ever conducting a physical examination or speaking a single word to me?" Victor leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his tired eyes with the back of his hand. "He did not conduct an examination, Rick." Victor explained, his tone heavy with absolute disgust. "That doctor is a known commodity in the darker corners of the family law circuit. He has a long documented history of producing highly favorable medical evaluations for wealthy clients involved in bitter estate disputes. Monica paid him exactly $75,000 in untraceable cash through one of her offshore shell companies to draft that specific report. She provided him with a highly exaggerated narrative of your recent hospital stay, claiming your minor heart arrhythmia was actually accompanied by severe cognitive decline, memory loss, and violent, unpredictable outbursts. She painted a vivid picture of a tragic, senile old man who was rapidly losing his grip on reality and becoming a danger to himself. The sheer malice of the strategy was physically nauseating. Monica was not just trying to steal my bank accounts. She was actively preparing to strip away my fundamental human rights. With a legally binding psychiatric evaluation declaring me incompetent, she and Brad could easily petition the state courts to grant them emergency medical guardianship over me. They could forcibly remove me from my own home, strip me of my ability to communicate with my lawyers, and lock me away in a heavily medicated memory care facility against my will. I would become a voiceless ghost trapped forever in a sterile white room while they methodically liquidated everything I had ever built in my entire life. But that is still not the absolute worst part, Victor continued, interrupting my dark train of thought. He reached back into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out one final document. It was a thick, glossy packet of papers stapled tightly together. He did not slide this one across the table. He handed it directly to me, holding my gaze with a look of genuine concern that I had never seen on his hardened face before. The fake dementia report was just the necessary legal foundation for this next move. I took the glossy packet from his hand. It was a primary insurance contract issued by a major international underwriter. I flipped past the standard legal disclaimers, the arbitrary health clauses, and the lengthy terms of service, stopping completely when I reached the central policy declaration page. It was a massive, comprehensive term life insurance policy taken out entirely on my life. The total death benefit coverage was exactly $10 million. I looked at the date the policy was issued. It was finalized and officially activated exactly 1 week ago. Then I looked at the listed beneficiary line. It was not my son, Brad. It was not the Dalton Construction Corporate Trust. The sole exclusive beneficiary of the $10 million payout was Monica Dalton. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I looked at the attached payment receipt. The initial premium was incredibly expensive considering my advanced age and my recent medical history, but it had been paid in full using funds secretly diverted from my own corporate accounts. Monica had literally used my own money to place a $10 million bounty directly on my head. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the conference table and clasping his hands together tightly. Rick, you need to understand the extreme gravity of the situation we are looking at right now. Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, urgent murmur. She has a secret divorce attorney ready to file papers. She has millions of dollars safely hidden in offshore accounts. She has a fraudulent medical document ready to declare you mentally incompetent. And now she holds a $10 million life insurance policy that pays out directly to her the very moment your heart finally stops beating. I stared blindly at the insurance paperwork in my hands, feeling a cold, dark void opening up in the center of my chest. She was not just patiently waiting for nature to take its course. A young, greedy wife might wait years for a wealthy father-in-law to peacefully pass away in his sleep. But Monica was not patient. She was dealing with the immediate crushing pressure of a $3 million debt to the Coyotes. The underground syndicate was demanding their money by the end of the current month. She did not have years to wait for a lucrative payout. She barely had weeks. She needs the $10 million immediately to secure her escape and leave Brad holding the bag, Victor stated. They are not just hoping for a convenient tragedy. They are actively banking on it right now. I held the $10 million insurance policy in my hands. The paper felt thick and heavy like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I did not scream. I did not throw the binder against the wall. A younger man might have lost his temper, stormed into their house, and demanded answers. But a younger man would have simply tipped his hand and allowed them the opportunity to escape. I am not a young man, I am a builder. I know exactly how to construct a trap so solid, so completely inescapable, that the prey does not even realize they are caught until the walls are already crushing them. I placed the glossy insurance document gently back into the center of the dark mahogany table. I looked up at Victor and the 3 silent forensic accountants. Thank you for your incredible work tonight, gentlemen. I said, my voice as calm and steady as a frozen lake. We have everything we need. Victor, prepare the legal injunctions for the offshore accounts, but do not file them with the federal courts until I give you my explicit signal. I want her to feel absolutely secure right up until the very last possible second. I drove home through the quiet, empty streets of Denver. The city was asleep, completely unaware of the brutal war that was about to unfold within one of its most prominent families. When I walked back into my empty house, I did not go to bed. I walked directly into my home office, turned on the small desk lamp, and booted up my computer. It was time to set the stage for the final execution. Dalton Construction was rapidly approaching its 40th anniversary. For months, my executive assistant had been casually suggesting that we throw a massive corporate gala to celebrate the milestone. I had previously dismissed the idea as a frivolous waste of money, but now it was the absolute perfect cover. I drafted a premium, highly exclusive invitation for the Dalton Construction 40th Anniversary Gala. I booked the grand ballroom at the most luxurious hotel in downtown Denver for the upcoming Saturday night. I compiled a guest list that included every major politician, every prominent real estate developer, and every single significant contractor in the entire state of Colorado. I wanted an audience. I wanted every person they had ever lied to, every person they had ever tried to impress to be standing in the room when the final curtain fell. The next morning, I drove the Ford F-150 directly to Brad and Monica's sprawling mansion in the upscale suburbs. It was a massive, ostentatious house built with money I had personally guaranteed. I walked up the manicured stone pathway and rang the doorbell. Monica answered the door. She was wearing a perfectly tailored silk robe, her hair styled flawlessly, even at 10 o'clock in the morning. When she saw me standing on her porch, her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, a brief flash of genuine panic, before she quickly smoothed her features into a mask of sweet, daughterly affection. "Rick," she gasped, placing a gentle hand over her heart. "What a wonderful surprise. Brad is just getting out of the shower. Please come inside. I will have the housekeeper make you some fresh coffee." I smiled, a warm, completely disarming smile. "No need for coffee, Monica," I said, stepping into the grand foyer. "I am just here to deliver something important." Brad came jogging down the sweeping spiral staircase a moment later, hastily buttoning a crisp white dress shirt. When he saw me standing in his hallway, he practically tripped over his own expensive shoes. "Dad," he stammered, his face immediately flushing red. "Is everything okay? Did the bank transfer clear this morning?" I reached into the inner pocket of my coat and pulled out 2 thick, embossed envelope invitations. I handed them directly to Brad. "Everything is perfectly fine, son," I said, keeping my tone light and cheerful. "I went to the bank this morning and set up the $500,000 transfer, just like we discussed. But that is not why I came over here. I came to personally invite you both to the Dalton Construction 40th Anniversary Gala this Saturday night." Brad and Monica stared at the gold-embossed invitations in their hands. "A gala?" Brad asked, clearly confused. "But Dad, you always hated throwing those big corporate parties." I chuckled, a soft, self-deprecating sound. "I know I did, Brad, but I have been doing a lot of thinking lately, especially after my recent trip to the hospital. I am not getting any younger. I realize now that I have been holding on to the reins of the company far too tightly. I watched you handle that massive commercial real estate deal yesterday, and I finally realized that you are completely ready. You are ready to take over the entire empire." Monica's head snapped up. She looked at me, her sharp eyes searching my face for any sign of deception. "What exactly are you saying, Rick?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, with suppressed excitement. I looked her directly in the eyes, maintaining the perfect illusion of a tired, loving patriarch. "I am saying that this Saturday night, in front of the entire city, I am going to publicly announce my absolute full retirement. I am going to officially transfer 100% of my voting shares and total executive control of Dalton Construction directly to Brad. You two have proven yourselves. It is time for me to step back and let you lead this family into the future." The transformation in their faces was absolutely sickening. The fear and panic that had been suffocating them for weeks instantly vanished. Brad let out a loud, breathless laugh, pulling me into a crushing hug. "Dad, that is incredible," he practically shouted, his voice thick with genuine relief. "You have no idea what this means to me. I promise I will not let you down." Monica stepped forward, wrapping her arms delicately around my neck. "Oh, Rick," she whispered softly in my ear, "we are so incredibly happy. We will take such good care of you. We really will." I patted Brad on the back, feeling the tense muscles in his shoulders finally relax. I knew exactly what they were thinking. They thought they had won. They thought the old man had finally surrendered his entire fortune to them, without a fight. They thought the $500,000 would keep the coyotes at bay just long enough for them to inherit the company and execute their individual treacherous escape plans. I pulled away from their embrace, offering them one final warm smile. "Wear your absolute best clothes this Saturday," I told them, turning toward the heavy front doors. "It is going to be a night that you will remember for the rest of your lives." I walked back down the manicured pathway, leaving them to their foolish celebrations. I climbed into the cab of my Ford, and pulled away from their pristine suburban street. I drove straight into the heart of the city to pick up Victor. It was time to deal with the wolves. Victor was waiting outside his office holding a heavy reinforced steel briefcase. He got into the passenger seat, silently resting the case on his lap. I steered away from the polished glass skyscrapers toward the decaying industrial district on the far east side of Denver. This was a part of the city modern developers pretended did not exist. It was a sprawling maze of rusted train tracks and crumbling brick warehouses. The air smelled of diesel fuel and old iron. I navigated the pothole-riddled streets until I reached a windowless warehouse surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. I parked the truck near the heavy rolling door. Two men stepped out from the shadows. They were built like freight trains, wearing dark coats that failed to hide the firearms holstered at their sitons. They did not ask for names. They simply stared with cold, dead eyes. I stepped out, buttoning my coat against the chill. Victor flanked me, gripping the steel handle of the briefcase. We followed the enforcers through a side door. The inside of the warehouse was cavernous, dimly lit by buzzing halogen bulbs hanging from high metal rafters. In the absolute center of the vast space sat a simple folding table and 3 steel chairs. A man was waiting for us there. He was younger than expected, maybe late 40s, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that looked entirely out of place. He had a thick, jagged scar running down his jaw. This was the current boss of the Coyotes, the underground kingpin who held my son's life in his hands. I walked directly to the table and took a seat across from him. Victor stood silently behind my right shoulder. The boss leaned forward, resting his forearms on the metal table. He looked at me with a mixture of amusement and dangerous curiosity. "Richard Dalton," he said, his voice smooth and calm. "I was incredibly surprised when my associates told me you reached out. Men like you usually send the police or try to hide behind expensive corporate lawyers." I kept my posture completely relaxed, leaning back slightly in the cold steel chair. "I do not hide," I replied, my voice carrying the steady weight of a man who survived far worse things than a dusty warehouse. "I do not send the police to handle private family business. I am here because my son Brad owes you money." The boss smirked a cold, predatory expression. "Your son is a complete idiot," he stated flatly. "He borrowed $3 million from my organization to play the digital market, and he lost every penny. His time is completely up. He promised us a massive payment this week, but my patience is exhausted. I am going to make an example out of him." I nodded slowly, acknowledging his threat, without showing an ounce of fear. "I know exactly what he did," I told him. "And I know how your organization operates. I knew your father, Marcus, back in the early 1980s. We ran in the exact same circles during the construction wars over the downtown transit contracts. It was a brutal, bloody time. Rival companies were setting fire to heavy machinery to secure bids. Your father controlled the concrete supply lines, and I controlled the paving crews. We had an understanding. We did business on a handshake, and we never once crossed each other. Your father was an honorable businessman who respected a fair deal." The boss's smirk slowly faded. The mention of his father changed the entire dynamic of the room. He sat back, narrowing his eyes as he reevaluated the old man sitting across from him. "You knew Marcus?" he asked softly. "I poured the concrete for the foundation of his first legitimate casino," I answered. "I know the history of your family, and I respect the rules of your business. That is exactly why I am not here to threaten you. I am not here to beg for an extension on behalf of my son. Brad made a terrible mistake, and he must face the absolute consequences of his stupidity. But he is still my blood. I cannot allow your men to break his legs or bury him in a shallow grave. That would bring unnecessary federal attention to both our organizations. I am here to offer you a much cleaner, far more profitable solution." I slowly raised my right hand, giving Victor the signal. He placed the heavy steel briefcase on the folding table and opened the lid. Inside were neatly stacked bundles of $100 bills. "There is exactly $3 million in there," I said, looking the boss in the eyes. "I am not paying his debt for him. I am buying it entirely from you. I want the original promissory notes. I want every piece of leverage you hold over my son. Your organization is completely out of the Bradley Dalton business. You get your money free of police trouble. I get the absolute sole right to collect the debt exactly as I see fit." The boss looked at the briefcase. A slow smile spread across his scarred face. He pulled a sealed leather envelope from his jacket and tossed it next to the cash. "The old wolf still has his sharp teeth," he laughed softly. "You have a deal. The debt is officially yours. Do whatever you want with him. We will never touch him again." I quickly picked up the leather envelope. As I walked out of the warehouse into the freezing Denver air, a profound shift occurred within my soul. I was now legally Brad's sole and unforgiving creditor. I owned his absolute ruin. I climbed back into the passenger seat of my old Ford truck, the heavy leather envelope resting squarely on my lap. The heater blasted warm air against my frozen hands, but the chill inside my chest remained entirely unaffected. Victor sat beside me, staring straight ahead through the windshield as I navigated the treacherous, pothole-riddled streets of the industrial district, putting miles between us and the underground syndicate. The physical weight of that leather envelope was staggering. It contained the original promissory notes, the signed loan agreements, and the undeniable proof of my son's catastrophic failures. I had essentially purchased his soul for $3 million in cold, hard cash. But as we merged back onto the brightly lit downtown highway, my thoughts immediately shifted away from the cowardly son who had blindly stumbled into a trap and focused entirely on the calculating daughter-in-law who had actually built it. Brad was effectively neutralized. Now it was time to systematically dismantle Monica. I parked the truck in the underground garage of Victor's office building once again. We rode the silent elevator up to his private executive suite. The forensic accountants had already gone home to sleep, leaving the massive mahogany conference table covered in meticulously organized stacks of financial ruin. Victor walked directly over to his primary computer monitor and sat down heavily in his leather chair. He cracked his knuckles, a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Buying your son's debt from the coyotes was a massive risk," Rick Victor said, his eyes scanning the bright screen. "But it gives you absolute leverage over him. Now we must ensure that Monica cannot simply abandon him and run away with the spoils of her treacherous labor." I stood behind Victor, watching the complex web of offshore banking data scroll across his monitor. "Our forensic team did an incredible job tracing her digital footprints," Victor continued, his voice dropping to a low, serious murmur. "We have the exact international routing numbers for her primary shell company in the Cayman Islands. We have the specific IP addresses she used to log into those foreign accounts from the secure wireless network inside your son's house. And most importantly, we have the blatantly forged corporate tax documents she submitted to the federal government to justify the sudden movement of those massive funds." I placed my hands on the back of Victor's chair. "She thinks she is a ghost," I replied softly. "She thinks because the money crossed an ocean, it is untouchable." Victor smiled, a thin, ruthless curve of his lips. "There are no ghosts when it comes to the federal government, Rick. Not when you know exactly who to call." Victor did not simply dial a generic public hotline to report suspected tax fraud. A man with his level of corporate influence had direct, highly confidential lines to the most aggressive regulatory agencies in the country. He opened a heavily encrypted communication channel on his computer. He was preparing a devastating digital package intended directly for a senior investigator he personally knew within the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, as well as a specific contact operating out of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit. I watched in absolute silence as Victor methodically attached every single piece of damning evidence the forensic team had uncovered. He attached the forged tax returns. He attached the offshore wire transfer receipts. He attached the undeniable proof that Monica had systematically siphoned $1.2 million from a legitimate American construction company and laundered it through European banks to avoid federal taxation. He compiled it all into a single undeniable narrative of high-level financial treason. He typed a brief anonymous message detailing the exact nature of her crimes and the imminent flight risk she posed. He hit the enter key. The encrypted files vanished from his screen, instantly transmitted through the digital void straight onto the desks of federal agents who lived for cases exactly like this. Now we wait. Victor whispered, leaning back in his chair and crossing his arms. The federal wheels turn slowly, but when you hand them a perfectly wrapped gift of offshore tax evasion and corporate money laundering, they tend to move with surprising aggression. We did not have to wait long. Less than 3 hours later, as the early morning sun began to rise over the Denver skyline, casting a pale golden light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room, Victor's secure phone buzzed on the desk. He answered it, listened intently for less than a minute, and ended the call without saying a single word. He looked up at me, the dark shadows under his eyes completely overshadowed by the sheer magnitude of our victory. "It is done," Victor announced, his voice steady and resolute. The Internal Revenue Service moved immediately. They coordinated with international banking authorities overnight. A total impenetrable federal freeze has just been placed on all of Monica's offshore assets. Every single stolen penny in that Cayman Islands account is now entirely locked down pending a massive federal investigation. I walked slowly over to the large glass window and looked out over the waking city. The final trap was perfectly primed. At this exact moment in her sprawling suburban mansion, Monica was likely sleeping peacefully in her silk sheets. She was undoubtedly dreaming of warm tropical beaches, expensive champagne, and her imminent wealthy freedom from our family. She did not know that her carefully hidden secret fortune was completely gone, seized by authorities who would eventually knock on her heavy front door with federal arrest warrants. She truly believed she was a brilliant mastermind, but she was just a blind rat trapped in a metallic maze that I now entirely controlled without mercy. The pieces were finally in place. All that remained was to gather everyone together in one room and let the heavy hammer of absolute justice finally fall down upon them both. The rest of the week passed in a tense, suffocating blur of quiet preparations and false smiles. Friday evening finally arrived, bringing with it a deep, heavy silence that settled over my empty house. It was the calm before the catastrophic storm. Tomorrow night, the grand ballroom of the downtown hotel would be filled with hundreds of guests, flowing champagne, and the loud, cheerful sounds of a 40th anniversary celebration. But tonight, there was only me, and the echoing memories of a life that was about to be permanently altered. I walked slowly up the wooden staircase and made my way down the long hallway toward the master bedroom. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The pale moonlight filtered through the large bay windows, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. I walked to the mahogany dresser and stood perfectly still. Resting right in the center was a silver-framed portrait of my late wife, Martha. I reached out and traced the cold edge of the metal frame with my rough fingertips. The photograph had been taken nearly 2 decades ago during a summer vacation to the coast. She was smiling brightly, the wind blowing her brown hair across her face, unaware of the dark future. I stared into her kind, familiar eyes, feeling a terrible, crushing weight pressing down on my chest. I finally spoke, my voice a rough, broken whisper in the quiet room. "I am so sorry, Martha," I said to the photograph. "I am so incredibly sorry that it has to end like this. Everything we did every early morning, we woke up freezing every single penny we saved when we had nothing to eat. We did it entirely for him. We wanted to give Brad the world so he would never have to struggle the way we did. We wanted to build a legacy of safety and prosperity that would last for generations. But I failed him. I made his life too easy, and it turned him into a weak, selfish coward. Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. The agony of what I was about to do to my own flesh and blood tore at my soul like jagged glass. It goes against the most fundamental instinct of any parent to actively destroy their own child. A father is supposed to protect his son from the wolves of the world, not throw him directly into their jaws. I closed my eyes, remembering the way Brad used to hold my hand when he was a little boy, walking around the construction sites. I remembered his bright laughter and his innocent wide eyes. I desperately wanted that boy back. I wanted to believe that somewhere buried deep beneath the expensive suits, the crushing debt, and the cowardly lies, my real son was still alive and waiting to be rescued. But that boy is completely gone, I whispered, opening my eyes to look at the portrait one last time. He died the moment he slipped that fraudulent power of attorney into my hospital files. He died the moment he stood on my porch and agreed to hand my entire life savings over to violent criminals just to save his own skin. And the woman he married is a parasite who wants to bury me in a mental asylum and profit from my actual death. I cannot let them destroy everything we built. The Dalton Construction legacy is not just a bank account. It is the hundreds of honest men and women who put on their hard hats every single morning to feed their families. It is the solid steel bridges we erected and the strong concrete foundations we poured. I have to protect the company. I have to protect the innocent workers from the sheer greed of our own son. I know you would understand, Martha. Sometimes you have to burn down the diseased forest to save the healthy soil beneath it. I turned away from the dresser, leaving the soft memories behind in the shadows. I walked over to my heavy oak desk sitting in the corner of the room. I opened the top drawer and pulled out a small encrypted black USB drive. It contained the high-definition porch camera footage, the shocking audio recordings of Brad begging the loan sharks, the forensic accounting ledgers proving the massive corporate embezzlement, and the undeniable images of Monica's fraudulent medical evaluation and her $10 million life insurance policy. I placed the drive carefully into my pocket. Then I picked up my sturdy leather legal briefcase. Inside, securely fastened in a manila folder, were the original promissory notes I had purchased from the Coyotes for $3 million in cash. They were the undeniable legally binding chains of Brad's absolute financial servitude to me. The trap was entirely loaded. I walked into my large walk-in closet and reached for the far end of the clothing rack. I bypassed the comfortable casual jackets I usually wore to the office and pulled out my sharpest, most imposing piece of clothing. It was a tailored, dark, charcoal gray suit that I had not worn since the day I aggressively fought off a hostile corporate takeover a decade ago. It was armor. I methodically put on the crisp white shirt, fastened the dark silk tie, and slipped the heavy suit jacket over my broad shoulders. I stood before the full-length mirror mounted on the closet door. I looked at the man staring back at me. His face was lined with deep wrinkles carved by decades of hard labor and recent heartbreak. His eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. I took one final long, deep breath, feeling the last remaining threads of soft, forgiving emotion snap completely inside my chest. The loving father, who had blindly trusted his son, was officially dead. Only the ruthless, unforgiving chief executive officer remained, and he was absolutely ready for war. The downtown Denver hotel was a towering monument of glass and steel. I handed my truck keys to a confused valet and walked through the grand revolving doors. The main ballroom was spectacular. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the 500 guests gathered to celebrate the 40th anniversary of Dalton Construction. The room was packed with the most powerful people in the state. I saw city mayors, federal senators, massive real estate developers, and hardened union bosses. They were dressed in expensive tuxedos and flowing designer gowns, sipping vintage champagne from delicate crystal flutes. The air was thick with the scent of roasted prime rib and the continuous hum of corporate networking. It was a beautiful, opulent lie. None of these people truly understood the dirt, the frozen blood, and the broken bones that had paid for this extravagant evening. I navigated through the dense crowd, shaking hands and accepting endless congratulations. I kept my posture straight and my expression carefully pleasant. It did not take me long to spot them. Brad and Monica were holding court near the center of the room, right in front of the massive stage. They looked like royalty preparing for a grand coronation. Brad wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that cost more than a master carpenter earned in 6 months. Monica stood beside him in a stunning emerald green silk dress that clung tightly to her figure. Diamonds glittered at her throat, and wrists purchased with the money she had systematically drained from my loyal workers. She played the perfect corporate wife, smiling warmly and resting her hand on his arm, projecting the image of a deeply devoted partnership. When they saw me approaching, their faces lit up with immediate predatory excitement. They hurried over, enveloping me in suffocating hugs. "You look incredible tonight, Dad," Brad shouted over the noise. "This is the big night." Monica kissed my cheek. "We are so proud of you, Rick," she murmured sweetly. "Tonight is going to be absolutely perfect." I looked at them, feeling the encrypted USB drive in my pocket. "It will be a night nobody in this room will ever forget," I replied, offering a chilling smile. The evening progressed according to the meticulously planned schedule. Guests took their seats at circular tables covered in heavy white linen. A lavish dinner was served and the wine flowed freely, lowering defenses. Finally, the house lights dimmed. A bright spotlight illuminated the grand stage at the front of the ballroom. A hush fell over the crowd as the string quartet stopped playing. Brad stood up, shooting me a confident wink before making his way up the stairs to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of faces with a practiced expression. "Good evening, everyone," Brad began, his voice echoing clearly. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate 40 years of Dalton construction. But more importantly, we are here to celebrate the man who built this empire with his bare hands." He paused, turning to look directly at me. His eyes were shining. He had actually managed to conjure real tears for this sickening performance. "My father is more than just a brilliant chief executive officer," Brad continued, his voice cracking with manufactured emotion. "He is my personal hero. He sacrificed his own health working through freezing winters just to ensure his family would be safe. He taught me the true value of hard work, unyielding integrity, and absolute loyalty." I watched him wipe a stray tear from his cheek. The audience was completely captivated. I glanced over at Monica. She stared up at her husband with an expression of pure adoration, gently bringing her manicured hands together in respectful applause. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. Brad spoke for another 10 minutes, weaving an entirely fictional narrative of a perfect father and a grateful, dedicated son who was finally ready to take the heavy mantle of leadership. "Thank you, Dad," Brad concluded in a dramatic whisper. "Thank you for trusting me with your incredible legacy. I love you." The entire ballroom erupted into a massive standing ovation. The applause was deafening. 500 people rose to their feet, clapping wildly for the beautiful lie they had just witnessed. Brad stood at the podium, soaking in the thunderous adoration with a humble bow. He gestured for me to come up to the stage. This was the moment they had been waiting for. This was the moment I was supposed to officially announce my retirement and hand over the keys to the kingdom. I stood up slowly, buttoning my charcoal gray suit jacket. I walked up the carpeted stairs, my face completely calm and unreadable. The applause grew even louder as I reached the podium. Brad pulled me into another tight embrace, whispering softly in my ear, "You are the absolute best, Dad." I stepped up to the microphone. The room slowly quieted down as everyone took their respective seats, waiting with bated breath for my historic corporate announcement. I looked out over the vast sea of expectant faces. I looked down at Monica, who was smiling triumphantly from the very front table. Then I turned back to Brad, who was standing right beside me, practically vibrating with greedy excitement. "Thank you, Brad," I said, my voice steady and resonant, cutting through the heavy silence of the room. That was a truly beautiful speech. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small black remote control. But before we get to the official transfer of power, I have prepared a very special tribute video for my son and my beautiful daughter-in-law tonight. I pointed the remote directly at the giant projector screen hanging behind us and firmly pressed the button. The screen flashed bright white, and the massive ballroom went completely silent, as every single person waited in anticipation to see my final gift unfold now. The massive white screen behind me flickered to life. Instead of a nostalgic montage of family photographs and early construction projects set to gentle classical music, the screen displayed a stark black and white video feed. The familiar angle of my front porch appeared illuminated by the harsh security light. The ballroom speakers, which just moments ago were amplifying Brad's tearful lies, now broadcasted his sharp, frantic breathing. The 500 guests fell into an absolute deathly silence. On the giant screen, Brad paced like a trapped animal clutching his phone to his ear. Then his desperate voice echoed through the pristine ballroom, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. "You have to tell them I need more time," my son pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine terror. The old man completely took the bait. He bought the entire story without asking a single difficult question. "I will have $500,000 in clean liquid cash by noon tomorrow." A collective, horrified gasp rippled through the audience. I stood perfectly still at the podium, watching the color drain completely from Brad's face as he stared up at the screen in absolute shock. He stood frozen beside me, his mouth opening and closing silently, unable to process the sheer magnitude of his public destruction. The video continued to play mercilessly. "Tell the coyotes to give me just one more week to clear the rest of the $8 million," the audio boomed, making several prominent city officials sitting at the front tables physically recoil in their chairs. "I promise you I will get them every single penny I owe them. Just please keep them away from my house. I do not want them cutting off my fingers." The mention of the coyotes, the most notorious criminal syndicate in the state, sent a wave of electric shock through the crowd of powerful developers and politicians. The illusion of the brilliant, capable corporate heir shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. I looked down at Monica. She was no longer smiling. She sat rigidly in her chair, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. Her emerald green dress suddenly looked like a costume she had stolen. But I was not finished. The porch video abruptly cut to black, replaced instantly by a series of crisp, undeniable documents. The first document to flash across the massive screen was the forensic accounting ledger Victor's team had meticulously prepared. It showed undeniable proof of massive corporate embezzlement. The numbers were highlighted in bright red, detailing the millions of dollars Brad had stolen from Dalton Construction and incinerated in high-leverage offshore cryptocurrency trading. Whispers began to spread rapidly across the room as investors and partners realized the true financial state of the man who was supposed to take over their lucrative contracts. Then the screen shifted again. This time it displayed the forged psychiatric evaluation. I read the final paragraph aloud into the microphone, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "Patient Richard Dalton is hereby declared legally incompetent to manage his own financial and personal affairs due to advanced, rapidly progressing dementia." The audience murmured in absolute disbelief. They looked from the screen to me, seeing a man standing tall, perfectly articulate, and entirely in control of his mental faculties. I pointed directly down at Monica, who was now desperately trying to shrink back into her seat. "My beautiful daughter-in-law paid a disgraced doctor $75,000 in stolen cash to write that lie so they could lock me in a psychiatric ward and steal my company." I announced, my words slicing through the air like a sharpened blade. Before the crowd could even begin to process the sheer cruelty of the fake dementia report, I pressed the button on the remote one final time. The screen transitioned to the ultimate piece of evidence. It was the glossy, heavily notarized life insurance policy. I zoomed in on the total death benefit and the named beneficiary line so every single person in the massive ballroom could read it clearly. $10 million, I stated, my voice echoing with a dark, heavy finality. Purchased exactly 1 week ago using funds stolen from my own company. The sole beneficiary is Monica Dalton. They did not just want my retirement savings to pay off their violent loan sharks. They actively placed a $10 million bounty on my head, banking on my immediate death to fund their escape. The silence in the ballroom was no longer just shocked. It was suffocated by pure, unadulterated horror. Some guests covered their mouths. Others stared at Brad and Monica with open, undisguised disgust. The perfect corporate couple had been completely unmasked as ruthless, parasitic predators in front of everyone they had ever tried to impress. The absolute humiliation finally broke Brad. The devastating reality of his total exposure snapped the last remaining threads of his sanity. With a sudden guttural scream of pure rage, he lunged across the stage toward me. "Shut it off!" he roared, his hands reaching out to grab my throat, his eyes wide with a violent, animalistic desperation. He wanted to physically tear the microphone from my hands and destroy the remote control, but I did not even flinch. I had anticipated his violent reaction from the very beginning, before his outstretched fingers could even brush the fabric of my charcoal gray suit. Two massive men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows directly behind the podium. They were the private security contractors Victor had hired, men who specialized in absolute physical compliance. The first guard stepped forward, intercepting Brad mid-lunge. He grabbed my son by the lapels of his expensive midnight blue tuxedo and twisted his body with brutal, practiced efficiency. The second guard swept Brad's legs out from under him. With a sickening crash, they slammed Brad face first into the dining table right below the grand stage. The ballroom remained perfectly frozen in a state of absolute shock. The only sound echoing through the massive space was the harsh sound of breaking glass and the heavy breathing of the two security contractors who had just neutralized the threat. Brad was pinned forcefully against the shattered remains of a dining table, his cheek pressed hard against the white linen cloth. Smashed crystal flutes and spilled red wine surrounded him, staining his expensive midnight blue tuxedo. One of the massive guards had his knee planted firmly between my son's shoulder blades, applying just enough pressure to keep him entirely immobilized without breaking any bones. Brad struggled weakly for a brief moment, but the fight had completely left him. He was no longer the arrogant corporate heir or the smooth-talking executive. He was just a pathetic, broken man lying in a puddle of spilled wine. I slowly walked over to the edge of the grand stage and looked down at him. The 500 guests in the room held their collective breath, watching the ultimate destruction of the Dalton family legacy play out in real time. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal gray suit jacket and pulled out the heavy leather envelope I had secured just a few nights ago in that dusty industrial warehouse. I held it up so the bright stage lights illuminated the thick leather. "You thought you were so incredibly clever, Brad," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the microphone so every single person in the room could hear the final judgment. "You thought you could borrow millions of dollars from violent criminals, lose it all in a foolish gamble, and then simply steal my life savings to cover your disastrous tracks. You thought you could throw me into a psychiatric ward and let me rot while you played the brilliant chief executive officer. But you made one catastrophic miscalculation. You forgot exactly who taught you how to survive in this brutal business." I opened the leather envelope and pulled out the thick stack of signed promissory notes. I tossed them casually off the edge of the stage. The papers fluttered through the air like dead leaves landing directly on the floor next to his face. "You do not owe the Coyotes $3 million anymore, Brad." I announced, the cold reality of my words sinking into the silent room. I went down to the warehouse myself. I sat across from the men you were so terrified of, and I paid them $3 million in cold cash. I bought your entire debt. I bought your promissory notes. I bought every single piece of leverage they held over you. Your violent loan sharks are completely gone, but you are not free. From this exact second forward, you owe me. I am your sole unforgiving creditor, and I do not offer extensions." Brad turned his head slightly, his wide, terrified eyes staring up at me from the shattered table. "Dad." "Please," he choked out, a thick stream of blood and saliva dripping from his split lip. "Please, I am so sorry." I was desperate. I did not know what else to do. I ignored his pathetic apologies. I looked over toward the side of the stage where Victor was standing quietly in the shadows. He stepped forward into the light, holding his sleek leather briefcase. "I demand full repayment of the $3 million by midnight tonight," I stated, my voice echoing like a judge delivering a final sentence. "And since I know for a fact that you do not have a single penny to your name, Victor is standing right here with a drafted federal lawsuit. If the money is not in my account by midnight, he will officially file federal embezzlement and corporate fraud charges against you first thing on Monday morning. You will not just lose your position at this company. You will lose your freedom. You will go to federal prison for a very long time, and you will serve every single day of that sentence knowing that you put yourself there." The absolute finality of the ultimatum struck him with the force of a physical blow. The last remaining shreds of his carefully constructed reality violently collapsed. Brad let out a loud, agonizing wail. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. He began to sob uncontrollably, his body shaking violently against the table as the massive security guard held him down. He cried like a frightened child, burying his face into the stained linen tablecloth. The tears streamed down his cheeks, mixing with the spilled wine. This was not the fake, manipulative crying he had used on my voicemail, or the manufactured emotion he had displayed during his speech just moments ago. This was the absolute terror of a man watching his entire life disintegrate before his very eyes. He was crying in front of the city mayor. He was sobbing hysterically in front of the powerful real estate developers he had desperately tried to impress. He was completely humiliated in front of the hardened union bosses who built our company. His reputation was permanently destroyed. No one in this room would ever trust him with a single dollar ever again. He would be a pariah, a cautionary tale whispered about at corporate dinners for the next decade. I stood on the stage and watched my only son weep. A small, buried part of my heart ached at the pathetic sight of him, but the hardened chief executive officer refused to let any softness show. I had given him every possible advantage in life, and he had chosen to repay that absolute devotion with the most profound betrayal imaginable. I did not feel victory. I only felt the cold, necessary resolution of a terrible infection that had threatened to destroy everything I loved. I turned my gaze away from his trembling body and looked out into the crowd, preparing to finish the necessary job right now. I turned my gaze away from his trembling body and looked directly at the front table. Monica was already out of her chair. She was trying to slip away quietly into the shadows of the crowded room, hoping the collective attention would remain firmly fixed on the broken man weeping against the shattered glass. She took 3 hurried steps toward the side exit, her emerald green dress shimmering under the dim lights. But I was not about to let her escape the absolute reckoning she had so carefully orchestrated. "Monica!" I called out, my voice booming through the sound system, freezing her completely in her tracks. "Where exactly do you think you are going? The show is not over yet." She slowly turned around to face the stage. The sweet, adoring mask she had worn all evening was completely gone, replaced by a frantic, wide-eyed panic. She looked around the room, realizing that 500 pairs of eyes had suddenly shifted away from her husband and were now staring directly at her. Her brilliant, calculating mind immediately shifted into survival mode. She threw her hands up to her face, letting out a sharp, theatrical sob that echoed loudly in the silent ballroom. "Rick, you have to believe me," she screamed, her voice trembling with perfect manufactured terror. I did not know anything about this. Brad manipulated me. He forced me to sign those papers. He told me he would hurt me if I did not go along with his horrible plans. I am a victim here. He has been financially abusing me for years. I was terrified of him. She looked out into the audience, desperately trying to elicit sympathy from the shocked crowd. Please, somebody help me, she pleaded, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured cheeks. He is a monster. I had absolutely no idea he was stealing from the company or dealing with those awful criminals. I stood on the stage watching her put on the performance of a lifetime. If I had not seen the offshore wire transfers and the forged medical reports with my own 2 eyes, I might have actually believed her. She was incredibly convincing. But I knew the absolute truth, and I was holding the receipts. You are a phenomenal actress, Monica, I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical sobbing like a knife. But you are lying to the wrong man. I know you secretly hired a high-priced family law attorney 3 weeks ago. I know you already drafted the preliminary divorce papers. You were planning to serve Brad with those papers the very second the Coyotes came to collect their massive debt. You were going to let him take the fall for everything while you played the tragic, innocent wife. Monica stopped crying. Her hands slowly dropped from her face. She stared at me, her eyes narrowing into dangerous, venomous slits. She realized that I knew exactly what she was planning, but she was still determined to fight her way out of the corner. You have absolutely no proof of that, she hissed, her voice dropping the sweet, victimized tone and adopting a cold, hard edge. You are just a bitter, dying old man trying to destroy my life because your own son turned out to be a complete failure. You cannot prove anything. I smiled a thin, completely humorless smile. Oh, I can prove every single piece of it, Monica. I can prove how you systematically siphoned $1.2 million from the stolen corporate funds. I can prove how you routed that money through European banks using shell companies registered entirely under your maiden name. You thought Brad was a foolish instrument you could use to get rich and then casually discard. But you were the true architect of this absolute nightmare. She took another step backward, her eyes darting nervously toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. She knew her master plan was rapidly unraveling, and her only remaining instinct was to run. She grabbed her expensive designer purse from the nearby table, preparing to bolt for the exit and disappear into the dark city streets. You are crazy, she yelled, taking another step back. I am leaving this place right now, and I am never coming back. I am taking what is mine. Running to the Caymans. Monica, I asked, leaning slightly closer to the microphone. She stopped, her hand frozen tightly around the strap of her purse. Too bad the Internal Revenue Service froze your $1.2 million account at exactly 4 o'clock this afternoon, I announced, delivering the final fatal blow. The color vanished entirely from her face. She looked as though I had just physically struck her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She was completely paralyzed by the horrifying realization that her secret tropical escape plan was entirely destroyed. She was trapped penniless and totally exposed in front of the entire city. Right on cue, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom burst open with a loud, resounding crash. The guests sitting near the entrance jumped out of their seats in absolute shock. A dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow letters printed across the back marched aggressively into the room. They were heavily armed federal agents from the Financial Crimes Unit, accompanied by several uniformed officers from the local Denver Police Department. They moved with rapid, terrifying efficiency, parting the sea of shocked guests as they marched directly toward the front of the room. The lead federal agent, a tall woman with a stern, uncompromising expression, held up a thick stack of legal documents. Bradley Dalton and Monica Dalton, the agent shouted, her voice easily overpowering the murmurs of the crowd. We have federal warrants for your immediate arrest. Please step away from the tables and keep your hands completely visible. Monica dropped her expensive leather designer purse onto the floor. The soft thud was barely audible over the heavy footsteps of the advancing federal agents, but to her it must have sounded like the final nail being driven into her coffin. The lead investigator from the Internal Revenue Service did not hesitate. She marched directly up to Monica, flashing a gold badge that caught the bright light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Monica Dalton, you are under arrest for multiple counts of international money laundering, wire fraud, and federal tax evasion." The agent stated, her voice sharp and completely devoid of any sympathy. Two additional agents immediately flanked Monica firmly, grabbing her bare arms to prevent any sudden movements. For a brief second, Monica seemed paralyzed, her wide eyes darting around the silent ballroom, as if hoping anyone would step forward to defend her. But the 500 guests simply stared back at her with absolute disgust. When the cold steel handcuffs were pulled from the agent's belt, the reality of her situation finally shattered her paralysis. She began to thrash violently against the grip of the federal officers. "Get your hands off me!" she shrieked, her voice reaching a frantic, ear-piercing pitch. "You cannot do this to me. I have rights. You are ruining my dress. I demand to call my lawyer right now." The lead agent ignored her hysterical demands effortlessly, twisting Monica's arms behind her back and locking the heavy steel cuffs tightly around her wrists. "Your offshore accounts have been completely seized by the federal government," the agent whispered close to her ear, loud enough for the front row to hear. "You can call whoever you want when we get you to the federal holding facility, but I suggest you get comfortable because you are not going to see the outside of a cell for a very long time." While the federal agents secured the thrashing, screaming woman, the uniformed officers from the Denver Police Department focused their attention entirely on the grand stage. My private security contractors stepped back, pulling Brad up from the shattered remains of the dining table. They handed his limp, trembling body over to the waiting police officers. Brad could barely stand on his own 2 feet. His midnight blue tuxedo was completely ruined, soaked in dark red wine and covered in shards of broken glass. His hair hung wildly across his bruised, tear-stained face. "Bradley Dalton, you are under arrest for grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, and criminal fraud," the senior police officer announced, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute authority. The officer grabbed Brad's wrists, pulling them forcefully behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the handcuffs echoing across the silent room felt like a definitive period at the end of a very long, very painful chapter. Brad let out another pathetic, agonizing sob as the cold metal bit into his skin. He looked out at the massive crowd, at the prominent politicians and wealthy developers who just minutes ago were applauding his fake, tearful speech. Now they were looking at a common thief, a coward, who had desperately tried to steal from his own dying father to pay off a violent criminal syndicate. The police officers turned him around, preparing to march him down the center aisle of the ballroom and out into the waiting squad cars. But as they guided him past the edge of the stage, Brad suddenly dropped all his body weight. He let his knees buckle, forcing the officers to temporarily halt their progress to avoid dragging him across the carpet. He fell heavily to the floor right at the base of the podium where I was standing. He threw his upper body forward, reaching out with his handcuffed hands. His trembling fingers desperately grabbed the fabric of my charcoal gray pant leg. He looked up at me, his face completely unrecognizable through the tears, blood, and sheer terror. "Dad, please," he wailed, his voice cracking with a raw, primal desperation. "Please do not let them do this to me. You have to stop them. I am your son. I am your only son. Please, Dad, I love you." The entire ballroom held its breath. For a fraction of a second, the heavy silence seemed to stretch into eternity. I looked down at the broken man crying at my feet. I felt the familiar pull of a father's instinct, the deep biological urge to protect my child from pain. But then I remembered the horrific psychiatric report. I remembered the $10 million life insurance policy that treated my death as a lucrative payday. I remembered the cold, venomous whisper on the voicemail. The loving father was truly gone, and he was never coming back. I stared down into his desperate, pleading eyes with absolute, unyielding coldness. I pulled my leg back violently, kicking his trembling hands away from my suit. You killed my son the day you slipped that fraudulent power of attorney into my hospital file, I said, my voice projecting through the microphone, striking him with the force of a physical blow. You are nothing but a cowardly thief. The finality of my words completely broke whatever spirit he had left. Brad collapsed onto the floor, wailing uncontrollably. The two police officers grabbed him by the shoulders, hauling him forcefully back onto his feet. They did not show him an ounce of gentleness as they dragged him down the long center aisle of the ballroom. Monica was dragged out right beside him, screaming violent curses and fighting the federal agents every single step of the way. You will pay for this, Rick, she shrieked, her voice echoing wildly against the crystal chandeliers. I will take everything you have. I watched them go, my face a solid mask of stone. The guests watched in stunned silence as the perfect corporate couple was forcefully removed from the anniversary gala in heavy steel chains. They were completely gone now. They were completely gone now. The heavy mahogany doors slowly swung shut, sealing the ballroom in an eerie, profound silence. I stood at the podium for a long moment, looking out at the faces of my friends, my colleagues, and my employees. There were no more speeches to give. There was no more champagne to drink. I leaned into the microphone one last time. Thank you all for coming tonight, I said softly, my voice carrying a quiet, exhausted weight. The Dalton Construction 40th Anniversary Gala is officially concluded. Please go home to your families and hold them close. I stepped down from the stage and walked out of the hotel alone, stepping into the crisp, freezing Denver night. The cold air felt cleaner than it had in months. The cancer that had been silently destroying my legacy from the inside out was finally excised. Over the next 4 weeks, the federal and local justice systems moved with a swift, merciless precision. Brad was formally indicted on multiple felony counts of corporate fraud, grand larceny, and embezzlement. Without my money to pay for high-priced defense attorneys, he was forced to accept a court-appointed public defender. He pled guilty to avoid a drawn-out trial, hoping for leniency, but the judge showed absolutely no mercy. He was sentenced to 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Monica faced an even harsher reality. The federal investigators unraveled her entire offshore network, linking her shell companies to international money laundering syndicates. She was denied bail, completely stripped of her designer clothes, and locked in a sterile holding cell to await a trial that would likely put her behind bars for over a decade. The divorce she had so carefully planned was completely irrelevant now. They were both ruined. With Brad and Monica securely locked away, I turned my attention to the physical remnants of their greed. Because I had purchased Brad's massive $3 million debt from the underground syndicate, I was legally recognized as his primary creditor. I worked closely with Victor and his team of ruthless corporate lawyers to officially foreclose on their sprawling suburban mansion. On a quiet Tuesday morning, I drove the Ford F-150 over to the empty house. The federal authorities had already swept through, confiscating her jewelry and his expensive sports car. I walked through the grand foyer, my heavy work boots echoing on the imported marble floors. The house was cold and completely devoid of any real love. It was just a hollow monument to their unchecked ambition. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I immediately listed the entire property, along with all the remaining luxury furniture and electronics, for a massive public auction. The sale generated over $4 million in clean liquid cash. I did not put a single penny of that money back into my own retirement trust. Instead, I established the Martha Dalton Memorial Foundation. I took the fortune my son had tried to steal and used it to fully fund a comprehensive college scholarship program exclusively for the children of my construction workers. The men and women who had broken their backs pouring concrete and laying asphalt for my company would now see their sons and daughters graduate from top universities completely debt-free. It was the absolute perfect tribute to my late wife. But Dalton Construction still needed a future. I returned to the downtown headquarters, and my first act was a brutal, sweeping purge. I fired every single incompetent executive and sycophantic manager Brad had hired during his disastrous tenure. I sold the ridiculous espresso machines and replaced the marble reception desk with the original reclaimed oak. The toxic atmosphere vanished, replaced by the familiar, comforting hum of honest hard work. I knew I could not lead the company forever, but I also knew I could never trust my own blood again. I needed a true builder. I spent weeks quietly observing my staff, looking for the right combination of brilliance and integrity. I found it in a young, dedicated structural engineer named David. David came from a blue-collar family, worked his way through night school, and was the only person who had ever dared to stand up to Brad and question his reckless financial decisions. I called David into my office, slid the executive blueprints across the desk, and formally promoted him to the position of Chief Executive Officer. I watched the shock and genuine gratitude wash over his face. He did not feel entitled to the empire. He understood the massive responsibility of the steel and the concrete. The legacy was finally in completely safe hands. I stepped down from the corporate board and retired to my quiet woodshop at the back of my property. At 71 years old, the sawdust and the scent of fresh pine are all I really need. As I run my calloused hands over the smooth oak, I often think about the profound lessons this nightmare taught me. People always say that money changes you, but that is a lie. Money doesn't corrupt people. It just removes their masks. It strips away the polite society rules and reveals the absolute truth of who they have always been underneath. I lost a son to that truth, but I kept my dignity. Blood isn't an excuse for abuse. You do not owe your life, your savings, or your sanity to someone simply because they share your last name. You have the right to protect yourself from the parasites who try to use your love as a weapon against you. Sometimes the family you choose to build around you is infinitely stronger and far more loyal than the family you were biologically given. I learned that the hard way, so you do not have to. Would you have sent your own son to prison? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to hit super thanks to support the channel. See you in the next life story.